all about. So Tom, want to get started?
Yeah, thanks a lot, Daniel. Welcome, everybody. I'm Tom Christensen. I'm the director of the China and the World program here at Columbia University. And I'm here to introduce a very special speaker. She's special for a lot of reasons, but one is that she's one of her own. She's a former fellow in the China and the World program when we were based down at Princeton University in the period 2015 and 2016. Christaina Lai is our guest today. And she is a research fellow at the Institute of Political Science at Academia Sinica in Taiwan, which many of you will know is a leading research institution in Taiwan. And she's also an adjunct lecturer in global security studies at Johns Hopkins University. She received her PhD in international relations from Georgetown University, and she came to China and the World when it was based at Princeton at that time, again from 2015 to 2016. She's an expert on Chinese foreign policy, East Asian security, qualitative methods in political science, and she's published in various political science journals and also in area studies journals like Pacific Review, like Asian Survey, and Asian Security. And she's gotten grants from various organizations, and including our own China and the World program, but also the Lyndon Bradley, the Bradley Foundation, the Global Taiwan Institute, Georgetown University, and the American Political Science Association. And she's a very loyal alum of our program. So Christina comes with a lot of energy to our annual conferences, wherever they are, you know, even in other parts of the world sometimes. And we really appreciate her intelligence and her positive energy for the program. Because one of the great things about the China and the World program is that we've built this network of fellows over years, and we have 50 plus now. And there's really no one more active and more involved than Christina, and we're grateful for that. So I'll turn it over to Christina. Her talk today is called Countering China's Economic Coercion from a Medium-Sized State Perspective. Christina, over to you, and I'm gonna put my my picture back up, but I'll be here listening. Okay?
Sure. Good afternoon, everyone. It's certainly my pleasure today to share my works on Taiwan strategy in countering China's coercive measure with a faculty member and research fellow and student at Columbia University. And ever since China has launched major reform in its domestic and international policy in the late 1970s, it has gone through significant rise in its economic developments and military modernizations. And this has led to both academia and policy circle about whether China will pose a threat to the United States and its regional allies in Asia. And more recently, over the last decade, China has punished countries that undermine its territorial claims and foreign policy goal with measures such as restricting trade, encouraging popular boycotts, and cutting off tourism. And this coercive measure has caused significant economic damage to U.S. partners in Asia, such as Japan, the Philippines, and Taiwan, and South Korea. And China's economic sanction may also lead to long-term effect in deterring or shaping the target country's foreign policy objectives that will go well beyond the short-term economic loss. So my talk today will first highlight how Taiwan responds to China's economic sanctions, and it will point to the agency of a medium-sized country in the shadow of great powers. And the second part of my presentations will offer some of my initial thoughts on establishing a possible trade pact in the Asian Pacific to counter China unilateral economic sanctions. How would I? Okay. So even though Taiwan is a weaker state, it is still be able to resist China's demand by minimizing the domestic cost of non-compliance to this one China policy or one China principle. And when Beijing implemented a ban on Chinese tourism traveling to Taiwan in 2016, the Taiwanese government actually effectively responded by subsidizing the domestic travel and making structural adjustments to Taiwan's tourist industry to attract tourism from Southeast Asian countries. So in this sense, Taiwan economic statecraft, that is to say the capacity to enact structural diversification and to gain legitimacy to counter China's influence, can contribute greatly to the theory development of international relations from the medium power perspective. And previous literatures on China-Taiwan relation has suggested that there's a growing business tie could foster a strong constituency in Taiwan with a higher commercial stake in China. And therefore, it will be quite difficult for the Taiwanese government to adopt a confrontational strategy toward China. And by allowing greater investment and commercial tie with China, the Taiwanese government actually kind of signaled its assurance to Beijing that it would not change the status quo unilaterally. And because the higher stake of economic costs involved in it. But however, I would say that this kind of explanation can no longer address the current dynamic in China-Taiwan relation now. As China become more assertive in its territorial claim, it is not Taiwan, right? But China has sought to change the status quo. Namely, China's economic benefit come as the significant cost because Beijing has always been held to negotiate the political status in the near future. And during a Tsai administration, right, President Tsai Ing-wen has generally refrained from provoking Beijing over the independent issue. So it is increasingly a stronger China that has aimed to pushing political unification, while Taiwan has remained moderate and restrained most of the time. And the difference in the relative capability, such as the realists will assume that, could offer a useful concept in understanding the international relation in East Asia. But I would say that the realist perspective cannot really account for this different perception of such asymmetric relations. That is to say, I think Taiwan as a smaller state might have this higher stake in China-Taiwan relation and put more resource in resisting China's economic efforts or sharp power influence. And on the other hand, liberals will often assume that the logic of complex interdependence drive all states, right, regardless of their size, to promote greater economic integration. That this kind of liberal perspective cannot really fully capture the current China relation because the possibility of military conflict remain pretty high in recent years. Therefore, I think the systematic investigation of China's coercive measure and Taiwan's economic statecraft could really shed light on the prospect of China-Taiwan relation, as well as the future dynamic of East Asian security. So I've laid out this kind of a theoretical framework for economic statecraft and power asymmetry. I think more work can still be done on how this smaller or medium-sized country like Taiwan can execute a series of policy measures to counter China's economic and security threat. So my presentation will show that how during the President Tsai Ing-wen administration, starting from 2016 until now, has been carefully addressed this domestic and political costs in responding to China's coercive measure. Right? So rather than directly counting on China's goodwill, good gesture, and reducing the reliance on China's economy, and has built up Taiwan's resilience over time. And Taiwan's economic statecraft in this way can really contribute to both IR theory building and to the study of Asian security. So given that this China-Taiwan relation has been in the typical characterization of power asymmetry, right? How Taiwan as a weaker party can manage to respond to China coercive measure can really help us understand the dynamic between the stronger one and the weaker one. Okay? Over the last 2 decades, China has greatly expanded its tool of economic inducement, including both carrot and stick to achieve its political objective, Let me give you an example, right? The Taiwanese businessmen in China will certainly lobby for a more moderate or even a compromising stand for Taiwan, right? Private firms or interest group and pro-China coalition have really this kind of really strong vested interest in China. So as China became more powerful vis-a-vis Taiwan, it has become increasingly intolerant of any possible move to allowing any kind of independent movement from Taiwan. So a smaller country or a weaker part like Taiwan is neither incompetent or naive when facing the economic stronger China. I think political actor, a business leader, or general public in Taiwan have started to become more aware of what they're entering into this asymmetrical relations. And so far, I think most of the literatures discuss the use of economic leverage from this great power perspective, right? With less attention on how a median or smaller sized country responded to this economic and political challenge from a stronger country. And the threat perception from a smaller state will actually plays a more important role than that of the stronger one in determining how to transform this asymmetric relations into the power of political influence. And the fact that, as of now, China has been unable to coerce Taiwan can be mostly attributed to Taiwan's constant effort in resisting China's economic and political challenge. So my work so far, my academic publication so far has addressed the shortcoming by proposing this framework of economic statecraft from the perspective of a weaker state. And my talk today will focus on how state can mobilize politically and economically, socially to address this China challenge. And since the 2000s, Beijing's policy toward Taiwan can be best exemplify this kind of analogy of carrot and stick. And strategy toward Taiwan can also provide excellent case to the study of China's economic statecraft and its constant military provocation toward Taiwan. And therefore, my theoretical perspective is different from realism or liberalism. And I would like to propose a framework of a symmetric relation in understanding the current China relations. So as of now, China has not really developed a formal or legal regulatory framework for its coercive measure. And China has relied largely on informal mechanisms such as with this control of state media or state-owned enterprise or selective application of coercive measure, right? For example, China has used domestic environmental regulation to implement its 2010 restriction on rare earth material against Japan, right? It has used full safety inspection on Norwegian salmon in 2010, on a Filipino banana in 2012. In 2017, China appears to have used informally pressure package tourism company to cut off trip to South Korea. And it also cited a fire code violation as a basis to closing down South Korea-owned Lotte department store in China. So, looking to future, well, China will certainly learn from its previous experience, right? Adapting the tactics that works and abandoning those that do not work. Right? More importantly, Beijing will certainly tailor their campaign strategy and finding pressure points in target country and minimize its collateral damage on its own economy and population. China will most likely to combine its economic coercion with inducement and other tool of statecraft, such as diplomatic negotiation, pairing with carrot and stick. Taiwan is really at the forefront of China's economic and military coercion, as Beijing will not renounce the use of force to deter Taiwan's independent movement. And private business sectors in Taiwan who are heavily dependent on the bilateral trade have a really strong interest in maintaining a stable China-Taiwan relations. Therefore, China's economic statecraft toward Taiwan can best exemplify this kind of analogy of carrot and stick. And Beijing's use of economic coercion and selective incentive has further shaped Taiwan policy in the future. So far, the Taiwanese government has responded to China's military pressure by diversifying its trade and investment in Southeast Asian countries to lessen dependence on China. But I would like to stress that it will still take quite a long time for Taiwan to achieve a long-term structural adjustment. As of now, Taiwan still remains heavily dependent on China's economy, making it really vulnerable to economic coercion and political pressure. So by enhancing our understanding of how and when under this kind of condition of economic coercion can impact the probability of conflict, and scholars in Chinese foreign policy or practitioners can really effectively assess the current state in China-Taiwan relations. So let me give you some recent example of China's, economic incentive or coercion toward Taiwan. In 1999 to 2001, for example, Beijing has warned the Taiwanese company that would be barred from doing business in China if they favor or support independence or have a strong tie with the Democratic Progress Party, so-called DPP. Right? The Acer and the Chimay Group both fell victim to China's sanctions as they were being considered or being seen to promote Taiwan's independence or have good ties with the Taiwanese president at the time. And the Acer electronic products were being removed from the shelf of major shopping mall with no clearly specific reason, with no legal explanation. And Chimay has suffered from a constant tax audit that disrupt its normal operation. And in 2011, China has signed a deal to purchase a $4.5 million worth of milkfish steel to Tainan County. And Tainan County is traditionally a pro-DPP district. Although this purchase has drew much media attention, it did not turn really into a substantive vote for the pro-China candidate in the 2012 election. And the major reason why such a strategic purchase did not turn into electoral support was due to the limited number of fish farmers that has benefited from the deal. And more importantly, I would say that it's only a one-time thing that failed to build a long-term, a long-lasting relationship with the Taiwanese fish farmer. And China attempt to win the Taiwan's heart and mind in the South through the specific purchase agreements and preferential treatment has been limited because China has failed to garner the farmers' support for the pro-China candidate in Taiwan's election. And the most recent case has been related to President Tsai's election, right? Beijing has recently employed this tool after the election of President Tsai Ing-wen and her pro-independent DPP party, right? So in response to her re-election, China has cut off the tourism to Taiwan. But through a series of policy initiative or diversification strategy, the Taiwanese government has succeeded in replacing the loss of Chinese tourism, primarily through a visitor from Southeast Asian country, even though it really did not fully replace the revenue loss from the Chinese tourists. And this is a recent example of China's economic sanction against Taiwan. In September 2021, China General Administration of Customs has imposed bans on Taiwan sugar apple and wax apple, claiming that there were harmful pests found in the produce imported to China in multiple occasions. right? In response to China's suspension, the Taiwanese government has considering file a formal complaint with the WTO. But in fact, it was not the first time that the Taiwanese tropical fruit has suffered from China's import restriction. Earlier in February, Beijing also suspended the importation of Taiwanese pineapple using the similar justification. So Beijing unilateral move have left no room for negotiations or legal investigation. And Taiwanese President Tsai Ing-wen has encouraged Taiwanese citizens to eat more pineapple, consume more tropical food. And the Ministry of Agriculture has also allocated government funds to subsidize the loss faced by the Taiwanese farmer. But up until now, the recent data has shown that China's import ban has limited impact as a sympathetic Japanese buyer have stepped in and provide timely support. And surging domestic demands and shipping to Japan has really helped the pineapple grower in Taiwan overcome Beijing economic sanction in the short term. But however, Taiwan's fruit export has remained heavily reliant on China. And the imports ban has been caused economic loss for the farmer. That's the fact that we cannot deny. So it is certainly quite difficult for the Taiwanese government and the farmers when they try to diversify their tropical foods export. After the sanction, the Taiwanese Council of Agriculture and the local government of Taitung, right, the county where most tropical food was grown, is helping the farmer to promote export of their produce to other countries like Japan, Australia, and those in the Middle East. So here I would like to highlight the most iconic case for Taiwan's strategy of diversifying its source of tourism as a way to countering China's economic coercion. When Tsai Ing-wen was elected president in 2016, Beijing has imposed limits on the number of China's tourism allowed to travel to Taiwan. And this economic loss has suffered by Taiwanese tourist industry has led to a series of street protests, urging President Tsai to mend relations with China. But the Tsai administration adopt the diversification strategy by attracting tourism from Southeast Asian countries and encouraging domestic travel for supporting local business. And although such policy measure cannot completely offset the loss from China tourism ban, Taiwan tourism industry have gradually lessened its dependence on China tourism and expand its clientele to become more diverse. And in 2018, the Tourism Bureau has offered a travel subsidy to program to boost domestic tourism. And most of the natural wonder sites in Taiwan were included, and it can be applied to both independent and group traveler. And more importantly, President Tsai has invoked a really common analogy to push through such a structural adjustment for Taiwan tourist industry. She publicly claimed that, will you put all your eggs in one basket? If not, let's make Taiwan tourism a stronger and better one. That is to say, overly reliance on China tourism will put Taiwan's tourist-related business in danger if Beijing were to threaten to curtail package tourism again in the future. And Taiwan's diversification strategy has attempted to lessen the loss of Chinese tourism by replacing them with visitors from Southeast Asian countries. For example, it has allowed the lower the visa requirement for visitors from Southeast Asian countries and promote greater exchange in education and culture and tourism. So even though it cannot fully recover from the economic damage brought by the loss of Chinese tourism, the number of tourism from other Asian countries has increased by 30% in 2017. So when Beijing curtailed the Chinese visitor to Taiwan, it actually kind of hurts this commercial interest of Taiwanese tourist industry. That is arguably the most pro-China or Beijing-friendly group in attracting tourism, right? Instead of co-opting with them, China's sanction on the package tourism has negatively impacted their business since 2016. But China's rationale was probably that this in hurting Taiwan's tourist industry, right? Hotel owner or tourist bus driver in Taiwan will put stronger pressure on the Tsai administration into accepting one China principle, right? However, the Taiwanese government, acting with strong autonomy, responded to Beijing coercive measure by allowing this top political leader to channel the pressure to comply, right? And the tourism industry can prevent itself from being hostage to China's political motivated sanction. So this structural adjustment of Taiwan's tourism can endure short-term to medium loss aiming for the long-term sustainable development in the future. And beyond tourism, right? The Tsai Ing-wen administration also adopted a new southbound policy to diversify Taiwan commercial type to South or Southeast Asian country. It could also help to lessen the negative impact of China's economic coercion and Taiwan economic dependence on China's market. And the government will offer a special loan to Taiwanese company to conduct business in ASEAN country, New Zealand, Australia, or India. And here I would like to highlight another Taiwan strategy through securitizing its bilateral trade with China. So Taiwan's securitization strategy can actually be traced back to the debate over the 2010 Economic Cooperation Framework Agreement, so-called ECFA, that seek to strengthen the trade tie with China. And Tsai, at that time, adopted this pragmatic approach in assessing this long-term effect of deepening economic integration with China. In particular, her framing strategy was raising this awareness among the Taiwanese people as to the costs that might undermine Taiwan's sovereignty in exchange for the ECFA. And when President Tsai and the DPP won overwhelmingly in 2016, the Taiwanese government have actively addressed China's economic and security threats to Taiwan's cherished value. And President Tsai was able to convince the general public that over-reliance on China economy could be detrimental to Taiwanese democratic system. So the concrete policy measure would include diversifying Taiwan's economy to seek alternative market in other Asian countries, or pursue a stronger tie with the United States, or promote local identity in face of an asserted China. So this here is a quick summary and my tentative conclusion here. So in examining China's coercive measure and economic incentive toward Taiwan, I offer a three-level analysis, and I found that the effectiveness of China's economic measure varies widely. Right? The first category will address China's use of economic measure toward certain Taiwan companies. They have faced severe restriction of conducting business in China or threats of exclusion from Chinese market. And the second one will focus on China's sanction and selective incentive in Taiwan, such as the reduction of Chinese tourism, right? Opening up its market agricultural product from Taiwan, or in responding to China's sanction on tourism, the Taiwanese government has made structural adjustment to the previously China-dependent tourist industry. So the Taiwanese government was able to partially compensate for the loss of tourism revenue from other sources. And finally, in the international arena, China's use of economic inducement has successfully flipped several Taiwan's diplomatic allies. And the Taiwanese government has increasingly faced the challenge of political isolation. For example, recently Beijing has offered the huge amount of financial assistance to Dominican Republic in exchange of breaking ties with Taiwan. And more recently, Beijing has adopted this increasingly inflexible stand toward Taiwan by actively rejecting Taiwan's diplomatic presence in international organizations such as WHO or the International Civil Aviation Organization. And it has also pressured several multinational companies that not to identify Taiwan by its name, and thus treating Taiwan as a province of China. Right? China has made a strong demand to hotel chain store like Marriott or Delta, or international airline like UA or AA to list Taiwan as part of China on their official website. So how can Taiwan's lesson can be learned from other countries in the East Asia or Asia Pacific region? So Taiwan's strategy in countering China's economic coercion can have significant implications for policy and the theory as well. As of now, China has been highly selective in choosing the instrument of economic sanction because it has always refraining from damaging its own domestic economy. And it is exactly the reason why China exit option has led to this responding strategy from Japan, Australia, and Taiwan in countering its coercive measure. So given this growing awareness, Asian countries are in a better position when they adopt securitization policy for their economy and diversifying their trading partner. For example, Japan, Australia, and the United States has teamed up together to diversify their source for rare earth material. And specifically, the Japanese government will provide financing to state-owned companies such as Japan's Oil and Metals National Company in establishing processing or an extraction facility for rare earth material. And the recent US-China trade war has also increased the risk awareness about the stability of supply chain in rare earth material. And the former Trump administration has sought to maintain its domestic supplies and processing to hedge possible China's economic sanction. Right? So even though there will be a still long way to go, to limit China's dominance on rare earth material, the country have raised their awareness in deterring China from weaponizing its leverage again. So developing a stronger partnership with countries in Asian Pacific region will not only prove the global supply chain with rare earth material, but also build up resilience against China economic coercion. And countries in East Asia and beyond, such as Japan and Philippines and Australia, have all suffered from Beijing economic sanction, right? So from a long-term perspective, policymakers in this country should really consider a collective, coherent, or even credible strategy to address China's economic challenge, as they have all fallen victim to China's use of coercive measure. Right? For example, in a hypothetical scenario, right, were Beijing to withdraw Chinese students from a targeted country or threaten to do so, right, then other countries in this trade pact could impose restriction on Chinese students in response. And such a trade pact or economic alliances could also involve an agreement to refrain from taking advantage of any coercive measure imposed by China. For example, Taiwan would refuse to fill the shortfall created by the import restriction on banana from Philippines, or American beef import would not make up for China's demand for Australian beef. This trade pact might begin with Japan, Australia, and Taiwan, discussing the kind of mechanism of information sharing and potential response measure, and then expand it to other like-minded countries in Asia Pacific region. And countries that are vulnerable to China economic coercion could really build resilience by deepening ties with each other and offering important alternative market in Asia. Right? In the case of Taiwan, like I just mentioned before, Japan's tiny purchase of Taiwanese produce, like pineapple, is a good example to explore possible way of expediting remedy for the challenge resulting from China's economic coercion. Right? I have to admit that there are still challenges to be overcome for such trade pact to succeed, and such as how to address the collective action problem and mediate competing commercial interests among its member states. Nevertheless, the economic and security benefits of this kind of trade pact initiative can outweigh the financial loss resulting from China's frequent use of coercion against specific industry or sectors in one country over the long run. Right? So far, this kind of countering strategy or a trade pact has received no official backing from the United States, Australia, or the United Kingdom. But I would say that by simply having this kind of discussion, right, on policy coordination, a risk assessment or joint statement to counteract China's economic coercion can help deter China's possible use of economic sanctions. I think collaboration between the governments with the private sector would be a positive first step in developing a protocol to address China's sanctions in Asia and beyond. And putting China coercive diplomacy in perspective certainly matters a lot for China's neighbor. I think scholars and policymakers in Asia have to differentiate between the short-term and long-term impacts of China's economic challenge. And you should avoid making an overly alarmist or dismissive of China's economic power. So I think in this case, Taiwan's lesson can show that China's use of coercion has been limited in producing this long-lasting outcome that Beijing has previously assumed. Over this last few years, China has executed a series of economic initiatives and coercive measures to Taiwan, Japan, and Australia. And to be clear, there is really no quick remedy or one-size-fits-all strategy in countering China economic coercion, as the target country will have to take a long-term approach, right, such as sector reform or structural adjustment or taking to a WTO trade dispute mechanism. In the long run, I think the secularization and diversification strategy adopted by the country are the weapon of the weak in countering China's economic sanction. And finally, I'd like to highlight this possible policy implication for the United States, right? I think the economic sanction, right, or economic coercion is a global issue that cannot really be addressed without the adequate international information sharing and coordination. The United States officer or embassy abroad can really play an essential role by gathering currently unavailable data and encouraging foreign partners or our its allies in Asia to take preemptive measure. The Biden administration should really begin to identify some useful trade policy tool that can be used to build the resilience of partners in Asia and beyond to resist China economic coercion in the long run. So in the future, Beijing will certainly likely to explore more policy options to apply economic coercion in advancing its political objective and national interests. Its growing economic influence and expanding policy instrument will certainly lead to this question. This economic interdependence will promote stability or foster conflict, or under what condition is China's economic coercion most effective? And how could a medium-sized or smaller country respond to China's coercive measure? So I think these questions are not only important issue for international relations, but they are also carry a policy implication for a decision maker in Asian country and the United States government. Right? So Here are some of my academic publication on China economic coercion and China-Taiwan relation. My lecture today was mostly based on the recent piece I just published in Politics on this China's economic statecraft and how Taiwan can counter China's economic coercion. And the recent short piece is a shorter one on China brief on how Taiwan's strategy can counter China's economic sanction on tropical fruits. So this is some of my recent publication, and I think it's toward the final parts of my presentation. So I figure it will be a good time, for a humble presentation of my work. So Taiwan certainly has been a forefront of China's coercion, right? So in the next few years, Taiwanese people need to fully support local produce by consuming more tropical foods, right? And house of fresh produce and commodity will be only a part of China's sanctioning strategy. And Beijing certainly will explore more policy measure on coercion to advance its national interests. And in that sense, I think Taiwan and Australia have much to offer to the rest of the world regarding how to respond to China economic coercion. I think stronger cooperation among Taiwan and Australia and the United States and other Asian countries can really establish the basis for a coordinated strategy in addressing China's sanction. And this is the end of my presentation. I would like to once again thank Daniel and Dr. Christensen for inviting me to this online meeting. I'm looking forward to the exchange of ideas and comments and suggestions later on. Thank you.
Thank you, Christina. I always take the opportunity to ask questions first before the audience, and I see there's a pile of questions lining up. I wanted you to address a little bit about what China is actually trying to achieve when it uses economic measures against Taiwan. And some of those measures, as you said, were carrots, where they gave various benefits to people, particularly in the South in the past, sometimes in agriculture. And other times it's sticks, where they remove those benefits and they put restrictions, phytosanitary restrictions on pineapples or on fruit, and they punish the South. It's not really always clear to me exactly what mainland China is trying to achieve in these methods. And the reason I ask that is, like with all political tools, whether something is likely to succeed or not really depends on the difficulty of the goal that you're trying to achieve with the tool. So one of the questioners in the queue already has said, these economic measures seem to have been very useful in Honduras and Nicaragua, but there the goal was simply to get those countries to change diplomatic recognition from Taiwan to mainland China, not to make them change fundamentally at home or impinge upon their sovereignty in some other way. So maybe the goals are different. And I wonder in Taiwan, do they really expect the sanctions to lead to the Democratic Progressive Party to lose elections? Or do they think that the sanctions and the threat of further sanctions will make the Democratic Progressive Party in power more cautious in how it behaves because it doesn't want to pay more price in the future? So I wonder about that question. And then I'm also, as an international relations scholar and someone who studied East Asia just like you have, I think there's a lot of logic to your solution, which is get all the potential targets of Chinese economic coercion to talk to each other and maybe even to come up with some kind of pact where they would help each other out if one of them came under pressure. And I know the Biden administration has actually talked about this as part of the Quad alliance structure and its move into East Asia. So the logic is very much there. And I'm very critical of the Biden administration for basically lacking an economic component to its strategy in the region. But in this one area, it has really talked about this. We need to help our friends when they come under pressure from China. And if they shut off Australian wine, we have to be ready to drink Australian wine. And if they, you know, the AIT chief, Brent Christensen, no relation to me, he had a big pineapple on his desk when the pineapple ban was put in place. So you see that kind of spirit, but where I think it runs into a problem is if it's an actual pact, multiple countries and Taiwan. And Taiwan is a member, as you know, of the WTO. It's a member of various economic organizations, but it tends to be the case that Taiwan can only join if the PRC joins. So otherwise the PRC is able to stop other actors from allowing Taiwan to join. So I wonder whether this trade pact would be an exception. So the two questions really are, what is China trying to achieve? How much of a failure has it been based on those goals? And where elsewhere outside of Taiwan has the mainland been successful and why? And then the second question is your solution realistic since it involves multiple countries, most of whom don't recognize Taiwan as a state and will come under severe pressure from the PRC for trying to form some multilateral pact with Taiwan in which the PRC does not participate?
Yes, yes. Thank you, Dr. Christensen. These are really, really great questions. As for the first one, I'll take on the first one. As you mentioned about what's really the end goal of China's economic sanction. I would say that, you know, as of now, China has been really good at deterring, right? Deterring Taiwanese government from declaring like formal de jure independence, but it has not been really good at you know, winning Taiwan hearts and mind or pushing Taiwan to political unification. And that's why I want to highlight, you know, this kind of the limits of China coercive measure, whether it's to economic sanction or its sharp power influences, right? So far, the economic incentive has been really selective and limited. Only will be, you know, add on to the benefit for the, you know, student or businessman or who already study or work in mainland China, but it cannot really expand its, you know, economic incentive to people who has now been living and working in Taiwan, has lesser connection with China. So that's how I want to give you the overall assessment on China's kind of carrot and sticks. It could be, you know, as economic, you know, China's economic power grows over time, it certainly has multiple tools and policy measures to, you know, hurt certain sectors in Taiwan, but it has not been really good at to achieve its end goal, which is to push for the political unification with Taiwan. That's on my overall assessment. That will be my initial response to your first question. As for this, you know, in terms of how realistic to the, you know, possible trade pact in Asia Pacific, I would say that yes, there certainly will be a collective action that has to be overcome in the very beginning, right? But I would like to highlight the fact by simply having this kind of discussion, right? Simply this kind of formal or even informal discussion could really signal the deterrence or help this victim, you know, who has previously you know, being vulnerable to China's economic coercion, has really come together to think about a credible way, you know, to deter China's future use of coercion. Right? But what about the case of Taiwan? So what about Taiwan, right? It's not even not a state, right? And I would say that maybe country throughout this, you know, Asia Pacific region may not really care that much, you know, about Taiwan. So how would a potential trade pact to be formed, and especially how would that potential trade pact to be concluded, formed, and also included Taiwan? So here I have offered some of my initial thought about Taiwan's role in this potential trade pact to countering China's economic coercion, right? So I would really suggest that country in East Asia such as Japan or the Philippines or the Australia, right? They should really collaborate with those like-minded country together, right? That has trade-dependent country to advocate a risk reduction measure, right? For example, they should not really advocate for this trade pact alone, right? Beijing is not likely to respond to this, trade pact if Australia or Japan, put this initiative up front, right? But I think coordination, right? Coordination with this and other regional government will certainly not be easy, but it serves as a credible threat or credible deterrent, right? Each of this country may perceive the potential threat by China differently, or they have different official view toward Taiwan. Then that's all right. But the most important thing that they should do this at the collective level, right? So that Taiwan could be included in this trade pact, as Taiwan has served a really important role to this global supply chain. And Taiwan has a really stronger, a very important strategic location connecting to the trade from Northeast Asia to Southeast Asia.
Mm-hmm. All right, so I'm going to ask one more, and then I'm going to turn it over to this 6 in line. So the last question I'm going to ask you is about the mainland's dependence on Taiwan, because you talked a lot about how Taiwan is dependent on the mainland, and you talked about asymmetry. But some people have pointed out that actually the mainland is pretty dependent on Taiwan too for various things, particularly microchips and semiconductors from TSMC. That some analysts point out that 6 of the 10 biggest exporting companies on the mainland are Taiwan invested companies. So I asked this because you said earlier that you think the one area of potential success for mainland economic coercion on Taiwan is that it is an additional deterrent to Taiwan from declaring de jure independence, which is one of China's goals with Taiwan. And then on Taiwan's side, one of the goals has been to prevent the mainland from using military force against Taiwan to force unification. And it seems to me that the economic piece is at least one of the factors that the mainland has to consider when it considers the costs of using force against Taiwan. If it got cut off from those microchips and semiconductor supply chain, and if they lost business opportunities through the cutoff of investment, that would be a cost. But the logic then, Christina, would be maybe different for Taiwan. The logic would then be we should have more contacts with the mainland so that it would be even more costly for the mainland to use force, rather than we should have fewer contacts with the mainland and more contacts with Southeast Asia, because that lowers the cost of military force by the mainland. I don't know if that makes sense, but it's a philosophical question about political science and leverage. It's not really an empirical question so much.
Yes, yeah, thank you, Dr. Christensen. This is a philosophical question, or even that could be really being drawn from the liberalist, right? Liberalist perspective that I just said. So as you mentioned earlier, like maybe China only really care about the microchip, the technology, right? Maybe, from the Beijing perspective, right? It doesn't really care about the tourist industry, the Chinese package tourism, or a restaurant owner in Taiwan, or a bus driver, right? This is not really their first top concern, right? Maybe the top leadership in China only really care about the microchips, right? How Taiwan can really contribute to the global supply chains. It's cutting edge technique knowledge on microchip. So that could be only the main reason that China has not really, launched the forearm attacks on Taiwan, right? And so that it kind of making a logical sense that it does not want to destroy Taiwan's infrastructure or the technology industry, right? Industrial park in Hsinchu, right? So back to the end of my presentation. China has been highly selective, right? Highly selective to when and how to use its coercive measures so that it can prevent or minimize, or let's minimize this collateral damage in hurting from its own economy or its population. That's why it chooses to, impose restrictions on tourism, right? Or tropical fruits, or pineapple, because China has really easily, the local governments or central government has really easily way to find alternative markets. So that's why that is exactly the kind of logic that Taiwan as a smaller country can easily find a way to responding to China economic coercion. So the liberal logic, I agree with the liberal logic that maybe more international commerce or economic independence can raise the cost for military conflict. But maybe China-Taiwan case, Taiwan-China relation, maybe kind of put it into the outlier or special case, as because China has always been really determined in wanting to Taiwan as a part of its territory. It's indispensable part of to its rejuvenation of China's nation or China's stream, etc., etc. So I think the dynamic may somehow have changed, and China will be more willing to use economic coercion or military provocation to deter Taiwan from de jure independence, so that these coercive measures they can allow some damage in hurting some specific sector industry in Taiwan, so that it can kind of maintain or prevent Taiwan from declaring independence.
All right, thanks. We could go to the questions. Daniel, you want to field the questions?
Sure.
One of them was about Honduras and about Nicaragua and the Dominican Republic. And I think she kind of addressed, not fully though. I mean, why does that work? Why is Chinese economic coercion work on those third countries that change diplomatic allegiances from the mainland to Taiwan, or vice versa, from Taiwan to the mainland? This is from Nohela Rivera.
Okay. Yes. Should I answer this question one by one?
Sure.
Okay. Yes. So I think this is a case in point that the Beijing has used, offer a significant amount of financial resource to flip its, a diplomatic tie from Taiwan to China. But I would say that kind of the logic is kind of different, because this third party, right, country in Dominican Republic and Nicaragua, they kind of get the logic. They can always hedge. Look, they can actually increase the bet between these two sides, right, China and Taiwan. So the Nicaragua or Dominican Republic can assume that they might get, maybe in the future, they might get a better deal from Taiwan. So they kind of switching side, depending on different circumstances for economic development or political power between Taiwan and China. So that's how there is already a lot of literature on how this third party, right, country in developing world trying to get a better deal between China and Taiwan. That's how this kind of incentive, economic incentive, carrot works for this developing country in Africa or in Latin America.
So there's a couple of questions in the queue that ask you to compare the way that China uses economic coercion and sanctions with the way the United States uses economic coercion and sanctions. Are there any differences either in the methods used or in the goals that are pursued with those economic coercive measures?
Yes, I think there's certainly a major difference, at least from my understanding, right? So far, in my previous work, China has really used an informal mechanism to implement economic sanction. While this, in the case of United States has this kind of formal or institutionalized regime to implement economic sanction. United States has really a clear set of end and goal or a means and end to economic sanction. While China, as of now, has been kind of ambiguous, likely to adopt informal measure to implement a sanction. Especially in my previous work in Pacific Review, I argue that China would likely to, saying one thing and acting another, right? Proposing a kind of justification for import restrictions or export quota that's not really related to the thing that China really care about, right? Like I said before, well, in 2010, right, China used this environmental regulation as a justification to impose trade export quota on rare earth material. But in reality, China really cares about its territorial dispute, like this China fisherman and its boat has been held up by Japan. I think that's the most important thing that China cared about at that time. So I think China's overall sanction doctrine or practice has been quite different from that of the United States. From China's perspective, there has not really been a clear link of the justification of the sanction and this final political objective that it wanted to achieve. At this, it was not clearly or obviously associated.
Thanks. There's a question from Columbia's own Stephanie Char. It's really two parts. It's really two questions. I'll go back up to some of the others. And this is how private businesses in Taiwan have responded to the Go South policy of President Tsai's administration to diversify the sources of economic interaction for Taiwan. And the second question is really about how Taiwan has been able to use its own economic wherewithal to try to cushion the blow when mainland China coerces third parties because of their relations with Taiwan. Lithuania came to mind. So those are two separate questions. And the first one is really related to a later question from Yinan He, who's a former fellow, and you know Yinan well. And that's a basic question about the diversification strategy itself, which came to mind to me, which is, how well has this diversification strategy really worked? How much less dependent on the mainland is Taiwan today than before this strategy started? And I guess, that would really take data. I think it's demonstrably true that Taiwan has much deeper economic relations now with Southeast Asia than it did before the effort started, but it also may also have deeper relations with mainland China in terms of percentages. So I don't know just how independent or less dependent the mainland Taiwan has become from the mainland in this process. And I think that's related to how they can get businesses on board in Stephanie's question. So I tied them together.
Yes. Okay, good. These are really great questions. As for the degree of diversification or dependency, right? I would say that the overall trend that, is kind of pessimistic, right? Taiwan, as of now, still quite overall has been dependent on China's market in recent years, right? That's why I said there is no quick remedy. There's no magic bullet for structural adjustment or diversification strategy. It takes a while, especially the initiative of a government and the business sector joining together to conduct a long-term structural change or diversification strategy to lessen the economic dependence on China. So I think in some way there's a really limited role for Taiwanese government in terms of economic statecraft. There is only so much that the government agency can do. That is to, provide incentive to diversify Taiwan's trading partner, or for the President Tsai Ing-wen or government official to raise the risk awareness, so that private firms or medium or smaller size company they kind of getting this kind of a risk awareness of doing business with China, right? That's how I said that could be really a limit overall for economic statecraft for a small, weaker sized country when they face a really stronger country with a really great economic power or growing economic market, right? As for the question about, sorry, I kind of get lost.
So there was a question about how well Taiwan can reduce the costs to other targets of mainland coercion, like Lithuania, and I think that it relates to your basic prescription, which is, you know, Taiwan is going to join a consortium of states that help each other when they come. How much can Taiwan bring to that? How much can Taiwan help other countries who get targeted by the mainland, and how?
Yes, so I think the Lithuanian case could be a really good start, right? But Taiwan can, first of all, Taiwan can offer its own lessons, right? Can offer its own lesson, I said in my talk, how the small, medium-sized country can conduct diversification strategy and securitization strategy, right, to hedge against China coercion. But in terms of this, you know, collective trade pact, right? Maybe Taiwan itself, what Taiwan itself can do could be limited as of Taiwan's, you know, comparatively relatively small market, right? But Taiwan is also embedded, deeply embedded in the East Asian or, you know, East Asian network of economic. So I would say that in terms of the remedy, expediting remedy, right? Maybe Taiwan cannot, you know, absorb that much of the consumption, you know, maybe for Australian beef or, you know, or American beef, right? Because so far there is only so much population in Taiwan that can consume fruits, pineapple, you know, etc., etc. But the important location or strategic location, right? The network connectivity that Taiwan has, you know, can really add on to this possible trade pacts in the East Asian or the Asia Pacific region in general to counter against China's economic coercion. In that sense, Taiwan can provide itself a great lesson and also provide itself with this cutting edge technology and its great strategic location and network connectivity.
Thanks. One question is about your definitions of economic sanctions. Zhou Xiaojia, she's at Purdue University. She asked a question earlier, and she wonders if, or he wonders if you can define economic sanctions, and do you include carrots as well as sticks in your definition, or are they very different in practice?
Yeah, so yeah, maybe I haven't really stated that clearly in the beginning of my presentation. I would say that, you know, when I talk about economic sanction, it's really about negative part, imposing quota or restriction or limiting tourism, right? But there's also a positive side of how China can implement its economic statecraft. That is for inducement, right? A government initiative, strategic purchase for Taiwanese produce, such as you could do that for pineapple or a milkfish in this case. Or the Beijing can also issue like permits or visa, right? Or even a preferential treatment for Taiwanese students or businessmen who want to study or work in China. That's kind of an inducement that will probably attract more people who work and live in China.
Yeah, it seems like the mainland has done that positive inducements for a long time. If you think about the degree of trade restrictions in the mainland for Taiwan products as opposed to the degree of trade restrictions on Taiwan for mainland products, it seems like the mainland is more open, and it seems like there's been a consistent surplus for Taiwan in trade with the mainland for many years, and Beijing has allowed that, even though the Taiwan restrictions are not necessarily WTO compliant. They're both in the WTO. So the mainland has never raised a case, to my knowledge, against Taiwan for being overly restrictive, because I think it's a goal of the mainland to make Taiwan more dependent, right? And make it more beneficial. But the interesting thing, though, that is while they've sanctioned pineapples and they sanctioned other fruits, apples, right? They've also tried to buy lots of things, particularly from the South, where there's the most support for the DPP. They tried to make it easier at certain times for those farmers to sell to the mainland, which follows a certain logic of inducements. But there has to be some frustration when, Han Guoyu wins Kaohsiung. It's got to be somewhat frustrating to the mainland strategy that it doesn't always produce. It doesn't always produce. I don't know. I guess that's a good sign from their perspective. He wins, but then he doesn't win nationally, right? He doesn't. His success in Kaohsiung, which looks like an early sign that maybe the KMT is back and the inducement strategy has worked, or the sanction strategy has worked, or some combination of the two. But then it doesn't get any it doesn't get any momentum at the national level. So Han Guoyu doesn't do very well at all in the presidential campaigns.
Yes, I agree with your observation, Dr. Christensen. That's why I think that, maybe Beijing's economic inducement in Taiwan domestic economy, it's kind of like a one-time thing. It's not really sustainable, right? That's why it cannot really, build up a strong or a constituency or a pro-China constituency. The milkfish things I highlight in my presentation is really a good example. Imagine that if you are a fish farmers in Tainan and the Beijing only make a one-time strategic purchase, then it's gone. Then you will not want to do business with the local government or the Chinese government in a long run, because you already know that it is a one-time thing, right? As a tropical farmer, or you're doing business with Japan. You could do business with Japan's or Australia or other parts of the country that is more sustainable, right? So that's why I think that's kind of the limitation of things that Beijing really need to take consideration. That is, if you really wanted to, implement this kind of economic incentive or really foster a stronger tie with farmers or fish farmers in Taiwan, or specifically in the South, you should really develop a long-term or sustainable strategy, and it's just not a one-time thing.
Okay, thanks. I think that's all of our questions, Daniel. I don't see any new ones. There was one questioner before that I missed. I feel bad because he or she left with that and pulled the question down, but I missed one of the questions. But thanks a lot, Christina. You got a lot of questions, and that's always a good sign. That means it was an interesting talk. And I think you're doing important work, and I think it does have implications beyond Taiwan to other actors in the region. We know that South Korea has come under quite a few sanctions in the past. We know that Japan came under sanctions. And I thought you made a very good point about how Beijing is different than Washington. Washington likes to announce its sanctions very loudly and say, we are sanctioning you because you did something bad, or we don't like your form of government. And Beijing kind of says, well, this week there's a problem with your fruit, or we're going to put a tariff on wine. Wine's not that good for people, so we're going to put a big tariff on Australian wine. And they don't always necessarily state explicitly that they are leveling sanctions, so it's a little bit of a different approach. And we don't really even know the details about the rare earths with Japan in 2010. It's still a little murky exactly what happened and who ordered it, but something happened. And Japan noticed. So anyway, thank you so much. I know our students are very interested in this topic, so I hope you'll stay in touch with them. And we have a couple of graduate students working on similar things. And we look forward to seeing you at our annual Indiana Festival, either virtually or in person. Thanks again for coming back to China and the World. You're always welcome here. And you're a stalwart alum who's really kept the community together. So thanks for that as well.
Yeah, thank you, Daniel and Dr. Christensen, for this great opportunity to share my works on Taiwan's and Chinese foreign policy. I'm looking forward to more exchange of idea with the fellow student here. You can, I have provided my emails in the final slides of my presentation. Feel free to email me. You want to get to know more about my works or get to know, how Taiwan can better respond to China economic sanctions. Feel free to contact me.
Thank you.
Thanks all.